Hey everyone, Lee with LG Speed and Custom here, and in this video we are turning John Weir's 1950 Fargo pickup into a hot rod. So this is John's 1950 Fargo. Fargo is a Canadian-only mark that was made by Dodge Motor Company, I guess. Basically, it's just a rebranded Dodge, same as how Ford had Mercury pickups and Monarchs and Meteors. Dodge had Fargo. I don't know enough about Dodges to know the history on Fargo, on why Fargo came to be, but here we are. So John's truck is completely stock right now. We are going to be pulling the Flathead 6 out and replacing it with a 454 Chevy and a T10 4-speed transmission. The front suspension is going to be coming out, and we are putting a Fatman Fabrications IFS front end in it. The rear suspension, it's already got a Chrysler 8 3/4 rear end that somebody has previously swapped in, so we're just going to leave that as is. The first thing that we're going to do in this video series, there's probably going to be a couple videos on this. So the first thing we're going to do is just start dismantling everything, pull the front sheet metal off, pull the flat 6 out, strip the front suspension out, and start prepping it for the Fatman Fabrications front end to go in. I've never installed a Fatman Fabrication front end before. This will be the first time on this. The reason we went with them is they are the only company that actually makes a kit for this style of truck. So we'll try it out. We'll see how it is. Hopefully it's okay. All right, let's open the hood. Take a couple measurements before we blow it apart. And so we're planning to reuse this radiator still because this radiator is a nice big radiator. It's in good shape and it fits the truck because it's designed to be in this truck. So before we pull it apart, I am going to take some measurements. If we go from our firewall to our radiator core, we've got 32 inches. And if we go to the outside of our fan blade, we have 31.5 inches. So I've recorded these and marked it on the firewall. And the reason I want to know those numbers is that way when we're fitting the new engine and transmission in, we know how far forward we can come before we have an issue with the radiator. I don't think we'll have too many issues with this. The V8 is a little bit shorter than an inline 6, so it should be okay. However, this firewall does have quite a concave that might interfere with the cylinder head. So that way, when we're mocking it up, if we slide it back as far as we can just measure from these points on the firewall. And if our fan is within 31.5 inches, we know the radiator is gonna fit. The other thing we're gonna do before we blow this apart is just kind of do a visual and make notes of what the current body gaps look like. 1950s North American vehicles were definitely not known for their fit and finish. So when we go to put this together, you know, we will obviously want to make the gaps as best as we can. But when you're putting it together and you get a gap that's real wonky or weird, it's nice to be able to go back and look at the before to make sure that, you know, maybe it was funky and weird to begin with. For example, this hood gap is tight here, but a big gap there. We got a big gap here, and we're tight there. When we go to put this back together and it fits like this, we'll know that's the way that it was, not that we screwed something up putting it back together. I want to measure from the ground up, and that way we know how much we've lowered it in the end when we're done. And also we have again a before, just to see what it's like when we put it back together in case something gets weird. For example, this fender is 31 inches off the ground, the one on the other side is 32 inches off the ground. So we know this truck already sits 1 inch lower on this side when we put it back together and we're done. If this is still 1 inch lower, then we know that that's the way it was before. Ideally, we'd like to get them both the same size, or the same height on both sides. But if the front sheet metal's got a twist or something in it, then we know that that's what it was like before. Now that we've got all our notes and we know what it looked like before, we can go ahead and start blowing it apart. We'll drain the radiator, pull the hood off. I've never taken one of these butterfly hoods off before. I've never really worked on these Dodge trucks before, so it'll be, I think it's pretty straightforward how they come apart, but it's a bit of a learning curve for me as well. So pull the hood off, we'll pull the front sheet metal off, get it stripped down to just the frame and the engine, and go from there. Look at that, Jim.
Look at it.
Just look at it. Look at these shock mounts. Those would work great on a hot rod. They're just like Ford F1 shock mounts, except for they go flat here. Got new brake hoses. Man, this thing's in good shape. All right, we got all the front sheet metal off, so now we're gonna focus on pulling this engine and transmission combo out. It's, for the most part, pretty straightforward, but it gets a little bit weird in here. This is the master cylinder right here. This truck is, it's kind of similar to like a Model A in the sense that the clutch assembly and the brake assembly appears to be attached to the bell housing rather than the frame, which means it's going to come out with the engine and transmission, which is fine, other than we got to figure out what to do for a pedal assembly on this now. Once we get everything out, then I'll address whether we're going to go with a firewall mounted unit or an under the floor mounted unit. I prefer the under the floor ones just because then the firewall stays nice and stock looking. But I don't know how much of a, if that's even a thing. We might not be able to do an under the floor one. So this truck, I just pulled the rubber floor mat out, and we got our transmission piece here. This will unbolt, but it looks like this whole toe board comes out as well, which is really cool. So I'm gonna pull that out, and then that'll maybe give us a better idea of what all we're getting involved with here. Man, look how far apart that clutch and brake pedal are. That's like a foot apart. Ooh, that was weird. They're all 1/2-inch bolts, except that one's weird. And that's because it is part of the throttle return spring. And it looks like once this piece comes out, this piece comes out as well. Oh, wow, look at all that space. I don't know why they stopped building stuff like this. This is so easy to work on. So here's our e-brake system right here. It just clamps on the drive shaft or the output for the transmission. So that's all going to come out as well. We're going to have to figure out another e-brake system. Here's where you can see the pedals attached to the drive shaft or the bell housing. It'd be cool if we could incorporate this somehow into the new system to keep these pedals, because they look factory in here. Well, I mean, they are factory, so of course they're going to look factory, but I don't know. It might be just easier to put something aftermarket in. Maybe something that's a little more streamlined. These are pretty big and clunky. This thing is, I think it's got more in common with a tractor than it does with a hot rod. Here from underneath here, we're under the truck right now. You can see the pedal assembly here, and it looks like it bolts onto the bell housing there. It's weird. Because yeah, the whole master cylinder, like the master cylinder is part of this. It's definitely not a very common thing. So before I worry about the pedals anymore, I think I'm just gonna yard this thing out. It's almost there. We got a couple motor mounts to undo, fuel line, a little bit of wiring, drive shaft. Should probably take the top of the shifter off and the emergency brake so it'll... Oh, and I guess we're gonna have to undo the brake lines because they're hooked up to the master cylinder. Man, what a pain in the ass. Every time you gotta pull your engine and transmission, you gotta bleed your brakes too. Just taking all the wiring off the starter, and I'm pretty sure this is the original battery cable still. It's pretty impressive. A battery cable from 1950 is still functioning. It's all covered in this, like, I don't know, like kind of like coiled slinky metal material. Metal covered battery cable. That sounds safe. This truck has all mechanical gauges, which is kind of cool. This is the temperature sender. Here's our oil pressure here. The cool thing with that is we can put these sending units into the big block Chevy engine and the factory gauges will still work fine. I mean, it just reads the water temperature. It doesn't care what engine makes the water temperature hot. Just undid the line off the master cylinder. These are like 5/16 brake lines. That's ridiculous. That is so big. So I'm laying underneath here trying to take this pedal assembly off because I realized that the clutch pedal, well, both pedals actually, they're not going to clear the firewall if I take the engine and transmission out with them still on there. So I can't get the push rod or the little clevis for the push rod on the master cylinder out because it's hitting the clutch pedal. So I'm under here seeing how it comes apart, and I'm like, where's the clutch linkage? There's no lever coming off of here. And that's when I realized that this is the clutch fork shaft, and they just mounted the pedal right to it, which is kind of brilliant, actually. That's really smart. So I ended up removing all the master cylinder. I took the master cylinder out because it is so close to the steering box that as soon as we go to move the engine forward to get it out, it's going to hit that. So I just took it out. And the pedals we had to take off because they were on the wrong side of the firewall. So when you go to, again, pull it forward, they would hit this. Clutch pedal came off easy. Brake pedal I struggled with for a while, and then realized you got to undo the steering column. What was happening with the brake pedal is as I was sliding it off that shaft, it would hit the steering column tube. So I just took the two bolts out up here and got Jim to pull on this really hard while I was underneath and managed to slide it off of that shaft. So I think we're ready to pull this thing out now, other than just fastening a strap or a chain to it so we can pick it up with the forklift. Well, I've just finished bolting all this stuff back on here for the next person. Notice I did not cut anything. I unbolted everything and took it apart properly, because just because John is not going to use this anymore does not mean that somebody else isn't. So that's one of my pet peeves, is when people are building a hot rod or a street rod out of a stock car and they cut everything out with a torch and just wreck it all so that it's not useful for a restoration guy. One thing I've noticed with this is, you know, I know a flat 6 isn't really what you'd consider a hot rod engine, but this would be so easy to build a hot rod with, because you've got your emergency brake system, you've got hydraulic brakes, you've got your clutch linkage. You know, you could basically drop this in like a set of Model A frame rails. You got your mounts already set up. As long as your frame rails are, you know, that wide apart, you can drop this right in there, and you know, all you got left then is just front axle, rear end, and steering, and you've got a drivable chassis. Drop a Model T body on the back, a little T Roadster body, maybe a touring with the back cut off, put a fuel tank on the back. This would be so easy. It takes a lot of the engineering out of building a car. So Jim and I have been sitting here for like 20 minutes now and talking about flat 6 hot rods, 6-cylinder hot rods and speedsters, and how easy it'd be to build a hot rod with that. Does anyone want to buy a 32 Ford? Building a speedster now. Anyways, we got to get back to this thing. So engine and transmission is out. I think our next step now is we're going to pull this front suspension out. So again, like the engine that we just took out, we're not going to cut anything. We're going to take this apart properly so that somebody that's restoring a vehicle or needs parts can still use all this stuff, because it's got new brake hoses and everything on it. These look like relatively new shocks. Before we pull it out, I'm probably going to get a quick wheelbase measurement. Usually the independent front suspensions, they kind of, the cross member, they tell you where to put it in the instructions so that you get the correct wheelbase, but you know, I'd like to know for my own peace of mind, I guess. Actually, I should probably dig that front cross member kit out and see if, one, it has instructions, and two, if it does have instructions, maybe read them, because I've never done a Fatman one before. So anyways, that's our next step. Speedster, 6-cylinder speedster.
Well, I'm glad I read the instructions, because like I was saying, the TCI front end and the Heights front ends that I'm familiar with putting in, they usually have in the instructions, you know, measure 13 inches back from such and such bolt hole, and that's where your center line is. This one doesn't. This one says to find your center line before you take the front end apart. So what I've done is I've got a level up on the frame here. So I made sure that our frame is level. It just happened to be a coincidence that it's perfectly level the way the truck is sitting right now. And now I've got plumb bobs on each side. I took a little piece of flat bar and ran it across from, you can see there's these spring center bolts here. So that's what I lined the flat bar up and then based our plumb bobs off of that. I'm gonna take this automatic center punch now and put a couple marks in there. That way when, you know, we clean the grease and stuff off, our marks are hopefully still there. I'll probably get a tape measure and make a measurement to the marks from, like, say this bolt hole forward or whatever, and then if those marks get lost, you know, I'll have a record of where they're supposed to be. So now that we've got our center line marked, we can go ahead and take the rest of this stuff out. I think we'll probably take this fuel line out while we're at it, because it's not going to work. Well, I mean, it'll kind of work with the Chevy engine, but there's a better way to route it. It's kind of routed a little bit weird, especially because the tank is in the middle. So instead of coming this way, we can just go that way. Simplify things. These brake lines can come out. We're gonna reuse the stock steering column, so we're gonna have to cut it probably somewhere about there. Steering box will come out. This brace is gonna come out. undo the spring hangers, pull the front end out. Might have to build boxing plates. I don't know. We'll try. I'll fit the cross member and see, but I think it needs boxing plates. So we'll have to build some boxing plates. It did not come with boxing plates, and I just read all the instructions front to back, and they're pretty generalized. It's an instruction kit for installing an IFS in most vehicles. Nothing specific for this vehicle, so leaves a little bit to the imagination, but we can figure it out.
All right, our front clip is out. All we got left to take out now is the steering box and this brace. This brace is bolted in, so that's easy. Now the steering box, like I mentioned, we want to use this column again. We're going to hook it up to some double D shafts. So to do that, we're probably going to cut it about here. We'll have to build something in the toe board to secure this end, which we'll cross that bridge later when we get there. But I think by cutting it, I don't know, we'll probably cut it, let's cut it right here. We can always make it a little bit shorter if we have to, but I think that's a safe spot. And also by cutting it there, that still leaves this much to repurpose the steering box. I think the steering box might work pretty good in a hot rod situation. It's got some length in here. It might work for cowl steer. I don't know. I wanna be able to save it though so that we can reuse it. So if we cut it here, we got lots of room to work with on this side, and we got lots of room to work with on this side. Just gonna use the Sawzall. Just like that. All right, we got 1, 2, 3 bolts, and then the steering box assembly will come off the frame, and then a couple bolts here and a couple bolts here, and this cross member will come out. Our steering cross member's out. I took these motor mounts out as well. I'm gonna put them with the engine just because if somebody does build a hot rod out of that, which I think would be pretty cool, they got the mounts ready for it. I also took out any random nuts and bolts or clips that weren't relevant to anything anymore, except for these ones because they're riveted in and I don't know, we might be able to use them for something. Anyways, so from here we gotta build some boxing plates and then start fitting the front cross member. But we're gonna do that in the next video. We're gonna call this video here. We'll call this one Disassembly. Video 2 will be front suspension. Video 3, maybe putting the engine and transmission in. And then video 4, final assembly, making it all work and burnout time. So make sure to subscribe if you wanna see the next video in this series and hit the notifications button. Tell me what you think about this project in the comments, and as always, make ssure to check out the website, lgspeedcustom.com, to get some LG Speed and Custom merch. Thanks everybody for watching. We'll see you in the next video.